Hello everyone and welcome to Arth Niti. I'm Shekhar Tomar. We are very happy to have Professor Krishnamurthy Subramanian with us today. He is currently a professor of finance at Indian School of Business and is a leading expert on economic policy, banking and corporate governance. He recently came back to academia after serving as the chief economic advisor to the government of India between 2018 and 2021. Welcome to Arth Niti, Subbu.
My pleasure, Shekhar.
How does it feel coming back to ISB?
It feels like coming back home. This is home. I've always been a researcher at heart. And those 3 years were essentially a sojourn out of home into something that I really enjoyed. But deep thinking and writing, and which is what research is about, is what I thoroughly enjoy. So it's coming back home.
So I'll connect it a little bit to your history, just understanding how did this transition happen? How did this opportunity come through?
So the process started somewhere around, I think I would say August of 2018. If you recall, my predecessor, Arvind, had remitted office in July. And in August, the process started. That's how, things turned out.
So I'll follow up on your tenure as the chief economic advisor. So you presented 3 surveys. They all have a lot of information on the Indian economy. So I'm going to go through some of these surveys, which I really find interesting. So in one of the survey chapters, you talk about inefficiency of small firms. So I'll just quote from the survey chapter. It's called Dwarfism. You say, the perception of small firms being significant job creators pervades because job destruction by small firms is ignored in this calculus. Small firms, and I emphasize, destroy jobs as much as they create. In contrast, large firms create permanent jobs in large numbers. Can you elaborate on this idea of dwarfism and why small firms hurt growth?
No, I wouldn't put that characterization as small firms hurt growth. Remember, the title of the chapter was dwarfism. And the idea there is, let me use an example from nature. If you have a dwarf plant and, let's say, a very young sapling that can grow to be a giant tree, that young sapling that grows to be a giant tree, when it becomes a giant tree, it gives basically fruits, it gives shade, all of the dwarf plant, on the other hand, actually takes up resources, but does not, provide the benefits that the young sapling that grows up to be, a giant tree does. And so nature, therefore, actually allocates resources to ensure efficiency prevails. And that's the idea that we basically showed here, that in India, and this is a piece of evidence that is very important. So there was this paper, if you would know, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which actually showed how job creation by firms changes with their age, average age, and across countries. So if you take, let's say, an Indian firm, a 5-year-old Indian firm on average, and a 5-year-old American firm on average as well. So, think about it as a race. So make the starting point the same. Let's say when they are 5-year-old, they're creating 100 jobs, both of them. Then track down, actually saying over the next 30 years, 35 years, how many jobs do they create? By the time the American firm is 40-year-old, that firm creates almost 700 plus jobs, while the same 40-year-old Indian firm creates only 140 jobs. In other words, in this 35-year journey, the Indian firm typically has only increased job creation by 40%, while the American firm has actually created 7 times as much jobs, or even more than that. I think we can give in so many anecdotal examples. You take an Infosys, in the 1980s when it started, there may be a handful of people. But today, look at the number of firms that it has. Look at it, maybe a TCS or any of the other firms that might have been having a handful of employees, but it's those small young firms that grew to be giants. They are the ones that create jobs. In other words, the The mistake that we often make is basically look at it as a snapshot in time. In contrast, you should need to look at this, dynamically over time. And when you look at it dynamically over time, what you'll realize is that it is the small firm that grows to be big. Those are the ones that create jobs. Small firms that actually destroy as well. So if you have enough small firms destroying jobs, then you don't have enough job creation. So from the perspective of job creation in the economy, from the perspective of productivity in the economy, and therefore productivity matters for exports, productivity matters to be able to compete with imports, all of these, it is extremely important that the structural reasons why firms remain sort of dwarfs, which is basically they age but they don't grow, that needs to be addressed. And that was the key point in this chapter. And one of the examples I'll give you, and perverse incentives that have been created by policy have actually been instrumental in this phenomenon of dwarfism. To give you an example, take labor laws that have prevailed. Once you become more than 100 employees, you have to start complying with a ton of regulations. Now, when a firm, let's say, reaches 95 employees, 96, 97 employees, then the promoter thinks that if I actually grow further, I become, let's say, 102, 103, I have to start complying with all these regulations. In contrast, let me do one thing. Let me start another firm in my wife's name, or maybe my bhatija's name, my chacha's name, my mama's name, or maybe even my driver or my maid's name. And as a result, you don't reap economies of scale. And as economists, we actually appreciate that economies of scale are incredibly important for reducing average costs, and that's what enables productivity. When productivity gets enabled, these firms can compete better. They also create jobs in the process. So this structural reason is actually extremely important for Indian economy to actually gain the vibrancy that it deserves.
So if I can just follow up on it. So you mentioned labor laws. So we would see this impact more in the manufacturing sector.
Yes.
Then probably in the services sector.
Correct.
But do we have like dwarfs even in the services sector? I think that is.
It's a good question. I am not aware of research in the Indian context that has actually looked at this. My sense is anecdotally, and I think I'll admit that I'm speculating a little bit here just based on anecdotal evidence, but it's a question that actually should be studied more carefully. My sense would be that the phenomenon should be there, in the service sector as well, because while manufacturing oftentimes is more capital intensive, services actually is more labor intensive, and so at the very least, therefore, these labor laws should bite there, equally. And so I would therefore, think that the dwarfism phenomenon prevails equally in in services too.
I mean, you really brought forward this point through this chapter, and I think it was a really important discussion that we need to have.
Yes.
But what's the policy outcome for it? Like, what can we do about it?
No, there's already been things that have been done, right? And this chapter actually had a significant influence on the policy changes that happened as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat. That's been one of my sort of, enormous sources of satisfaction, that each of the three surveys that I wrote, actually, each one of them had a telling impact on, on policy changes. And that's something. So in this particular case, if you look at the PLI scheme is conditioned on growth of the firm. It is not based just on actually, democratizing the taxpayers.
Okay, so I'll take a step back here because I think this scheme is interesting. But if you can tell us this timeline, you said there are dwarfs, we keep giving them benefits, even if they survive for 30 years.
Right.
But based on the scheme, what changed? You don't want to give them benefit for their whole lifetime, right?
So no, I think by the way, for the viewers that are not familiar, PLI is basically the production linked incentive scheme, and as in the name itself, it suggests that if you continue to grow, then you will basically enjoy the subsidies that from the taxpayers' money. As I mentioned, the problem that we had, the structural problem was that the taxpayers' money was going into dwarfs, firms that were aging but were not growing. And as a result, you basically had inefficiencies. So, one way of tackling this inefficiency was to basically incentivize growth of firms. As I said earlier as well, firms, young firms that grow are the ones that basically are more productive, create jobs. And so this scheme was essentially a way of incentivizing growth and thereby, addressing some of the perverse incentives on the, on the dwarfism that create the dwarfism. Second thing that actually it was done was the labor law legislation has been changed, and there, one of the key parts is raising the threshold from 100 to 300, on the on some of the industrial action aspects, and I think on dismissal as well. The third thing that was done was to change the MSME definitions. The MSME definitions were so restrictive that actually, even with very a little bit of growth for a couple of years, you would basically hit that threshold from when perverse incentives would start kicking in. And therefore, the MSME definitions have been changed to ensure that firms can continue to grow much. So in other words, the ceiling has been raised much more. So these three things were actually intended, to directly address this phenomenon of dwarfism in the Indian economy.
So it's basically incentivizing MSMEs to become something bigger, and you're
Exactly.
betting on those who are more efficient.
Exactly. And the last point actually I would mention is that, it's also behooves the promoter, to think for himself or herself that the maximum benefit that comes from the little bit of visionary thinking, not the myopic thinking of here and now, what is the money I'm going to make, by basically starting another firm, let's say, in your wife's or bhatija's or chacha's name. If promoters have a little bit of a more long run vision. So, I think the point therefore was to really highlight that a promoter actually that grows his or her firm, reaps economies of scale, becomes more productive, therefore can compete with imports better, can do exports more as well, create jobs actually, and support so many families, and most importantly help himself as well. He becomes richer too. That's the point that was actually really addressed in this chapter.
So I'll go a bit to the macro side of the economy. We already discussed the micro part. So in one of your chapters, you also talk about the bias of credit rating agencies, and I think that was another highlight of the chapter. So I'll again quote from the chapter, but just to give the context, it's after 2019 when Moody's downgraded the Indian economy from stable to negative outlook. And you mentioned never in the history of sovereign credit ratings has the fifth largest economy in the world been rated as the lowest rung of the investment grade, BBB minus, reflecting the economic size and thereby the ability to repay the debt. The fifth largest economy has predominantly been rated AAA. China and India are the only exceptions to this rule. China was A minus in 2005 and India is BBB minus. What explains this bias?
So firstly, let me give you, I think you did mention the downgrade, but the context actually to this chapter was much wider. Having observed myself, as financial economists, we see this, and ratings, default, these are things that we sort of teach our students very often. So if you think about the default itself, it is affected by two things, which is the ability to repay and the willingness to repay, right? That's theoretically, there is nothing else that actually, or conceptually, nothing else matters for default, which is the ability to repay and the willingness to repay. Now, if you look at willingness to repay, India, in its history has never ever defaulted on its obligations. We've had now Russia actually defaulting. There have been Latin American countries that have defaulted, many times. But India as an emerging economy has never defaulted. Even at the lowest point in India's economy in 1991, when we were actually going through such a large balance of payments crisis, we actually shipped gold to the Bank of England and to the Bank of Japan to actually honor our obligations. And it's important for me to highlight that this decision to default is not an economic decision for India. It is basically, there is bilateral consensus that it is more a spiritual, philosophical, a commitment that we will not default on our obligations. So that's the first point, that our willingness to repay is gold standard. What about the ability to repay? If you look at the ability to repay, our foreign currency obligations are actually minuscule. compared to other countries, right? If you even, and the sovereign, of course, has never gone and borrowed, in
Yeah, most of our debt is domestic.
in fact, and even those, only the debt that comes from multilateral agencies is foreign currency denominated. But the Indian sovereign has never gone and borrowed from markets. So the sovereign bond markets actually in foreign currency. So where is the question of the Indian sovereign defaulting? So if your ability to repay is actually close to gold standard, because all your obligations are in rupee terms, and if your willingness to repay is also gold standard, then what in the world can justify this this triple B minus rating? Conceptually, I actually just don't see it. That's the larger context. The second key aspect that is and here I'd looked at, unlike in the corporate bond ratings, right, where there is a very strong correlation between actually the fundamentals and the default performance. If you pick up S&P ratings or Moody's ratings, you go and correlate it, you'll find a very strong correlation. In contrast, with sovereign bond ratings, actually that correlation is very, very tenuous, which actually tells me that clearly the model that is being used to actually arrive at these ratings itself is actually quite questionable. And why is it questionable? Because the model basically, I think is an empirical model that has not been changed much after the global financial crisis. After the global financial crisis, you've had countries that actually were supposed to be gold standard that have gone and actually defaulted, on their obligations, and yet there has basically maybe been a marginal tweak here, a marginal tweak there, on a model that I think is fundamentally not capturing some of the key aspects, as I just explained, the willingness to repay or the ability to repay. And the third point, which is, why does the size of the economy matter? The size of the economy matters because it is basically, if you're looking at, let's say, debt to GDP, right, as the size of the economy, the denominator is the GDP, which is why, and that affects, let's say, the ability to repay. And there's the very first chart that I showed you, which actually tells the story as loud, as 1,000 words, that the fifth largest economy has never ever been so lowly rated. When the fifth largest economy has been a non-Asian economy, a Western power, that fifth largest economy has always been a AAA, maybe at worst, maybe a AA. It's only when it's an Asian economy actually that a China or now an India, and at least China was rated as an A. India is rated as a triple B. And I think anyways, I've actually written on other aspects about how the Western perspective oftentimes on India is actually very, very colored in different ways. So this is a symptom of this problem.
So just following on this, like how costly is this bias for a country like India?
So, and that's a good question, because that's something we examined very carefully in the second half of this chapter by correlating it with stock market, bond market, foreign exchange market responses. Turns out that the market is actually far smarter than the rating agencies are. The market actually factors the fact that the ratings are not reflecting the fundamentals much better than the rating agencies. In other words, what I'm actually articulating conceptually, the market in its own way is capturing very well that the Indian rating does not reflect its fundamentals. But here's the reason why this is important is that there is a discontinuity in markets between investment grade versus non-investment grade. So why? Because if the sovereign rating were not investment grade, then a lot of portfolio firms that basically put their money in a country cannot, they'll have to withdraw.
So this is basically like some pension fund, they're obligated to only invest in
only
AAA.
invest in. So the only concern, and which the concern is now, of course, has gone away. But at the time when we wrote the chapter with the COVID, amidst the COVID pandemic, where every country had to spend, and we basically had to point out that the rating agencies are, the rating is not reflecting our fundamentals. So to basically redouble the message to the markets that this is not reflecting our fundamentals, so don't react, which anyway they were not, and we wanted to warn on that count. So I think that discontinuity is what was the primary concern that I wanted to avoid, and therefore put this chapter out very clear. And I think I've engaged with rating agencies. I can tell you I'm very disappointed in their conceptual understanding of these things. They talk a good talk, but I think when you dig deeper and ask them about actually the models, oftentimes I think the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing.
But the cost can still be significantly high because we don't get these portfolio investment, which should ideally land up in India and lead to more investment.
No, I'm not. No, I'm don't. I think that's a misinterpretation. As I said, we are actually investment grade. If we basically were downgraded below the investment grade, then there would be a discontinuity. Foreign inflows, basically portfolio inflows, would stop, which did not happen. And now of course there's been a revision as well. A positive revision in rating. So that concern actually, which was material at the time when the chapter was written, is not material anymore. So I think the bottom line, what I want to say is that the market and investors recognize very clearly that the sovereign rating agencies are wrong in their assessment of India's fundamentals as reflected in the in that sovereign rating.
So just building on this further, like you were CA during one of the most extraordinary times, which is COVID. So what explains the fiscal policy of the government during this time? And if I may add to it, we had one of the most stringent lockdowns, also probably one of the strongest impact of COVID itself. But our fiscal expenditure, the additional fiscal expenditure, has been below average among the emerging market economies. Do you think this bias of rating agencies and some fear of rating agencies were at the back of the mind when the fiscal policy was decided by the government?
No. I'm going to be emphatic in basically saying that it was not. It was actually, and let me start off by mentioning how India now singularly stands out for the macro fundamentals, that if you compare with advanced economies.
No, I'm fiscally conservative, but I want to understand what was the decision making.
I want to explain to you why actually, if in fact fiscal conservatism, as long as it is driven by good economic principles, I think it's fine. But fiscal conservatism or fiscal aggressiveness actually based on ideology, I think ideology in any case actually should be driven by fundamentals. I have a problem with basically just economic ideologies that are not driven well by good economic arguments or good data. And that's the point I want to explain here. But let me first start out by mentioning that if you look at India's fundamentals, take any of the macro statistics, look at inflation, look at current account deficit, look at basically the overall fiscal deficit itself, and look at the currency depreciation, etc. Turkey, for instance, now is actually at 70%, 80% inflation, and it's staring at maybe 100% plus inflation. Argentina is at 60% inflation. Brazil is basically in double digits inflation. India, on the other hand, actually is, last print was 7%, which is just 4% greater than the historical average. Advanced economies are 400% higher than the historical average. Why? And this is where actually comes to the India, when the COVID was happening, we identified very clearly that COVID was not just a demand side phenomenon, it was also a supply side phenomenon. Point number one, which means that if you basically only do demand side measures, the Keynesian pump priming or money printing that all advanced economies did and all emerging economies copy pasted the advanced economies on, and which is why our fiscal spend was actually lower than that of the emerging economies, and I'll explain why. That if you suppose you have just take sort of Econ 101 demand and supply, nothing is done, suppose laissez-faire, right? What would happen is there would be a shrink in demand, there would be a shrink in supply as well. So inflation would not be a problem, but output would decline significantly. So GDP growth would actually be very materially impacted, but would not there'll be a huge decline in GDP growth. Now, what is it that the advanced economies and the emerging economies that mimic the advanced economies did was they basically did only revenue spending, fiscal, and so push demand back up, not as much as it would have been without COVID, but they were able to get back. India also did, and I'll come to that, but did nothing on supply. So what do you have? If you have a shrink in supply, demand coming back close to almost, or maybe 8% lower than, let's say, pre-COVID, then you have runaway inflation. And I think you don't need actually, even a PhD trained economist to tell you this. An undergrad student actually would tell you that if you basically don't work on supply, you just push demand back up, you'll have prices going up. What you need a PhD for is actually a priori, when the crisis was happening, to identify that this is both a demand side and a supply side phenomenon, and therefore the optimal policy response has to be one that actually is prudent on the demand side, maximize the bang for the buck, and also implement supply side measures. India did that on the demand side, and actually, even though if you look at the actual numbers, it looks like we may have spent less, but the impact was as good because one, we did a lot of in-kind transfers. For instance, 800 million people got free food. If you look at the other countries, they don't have the kind of PDS, public distribution system, that we have, and therefore they had to give cash transfers for people to basically for their.
So in a way, it was more targeted in terms of what you're spending on.
Yes, and let me, there are a few other elements actually to make sure, because there's this criticism that actually is leveled, and I think, unfairly leveled, because people have not understood the nuances that well. So, because we have a very robust PDS system and the direct benefit transfers as well, we gave 800 million people free food. That free food included cereals and pulses and LPG as well. We also gave cash transfers, but cash transfers only to the vulnerable, to widows, actually senior citizens. The PM Kisan basically was increased. So that was the cash transfer part. And a big part of what we did was we actually gave loans through the financial sector, but overlaid with guarantees from the fisc. And this basically did two things. One, it actually utilizes the leverage that the financial sector has. If the fisc basically has to give 100 rupees, the entire spending is 100. But if you just give a guarantee, your cost, which is not immediate, cost would basically be 2-3 years later when the economy is doing much better, maybe 3 rupees, 4 rupees, or 5 rupees. As a result, by using leverage, you're able to do much more. Second, the financial sector has information at the level of the borrower or the individual that the fisc never will have. And it is also incentive compatible in the way we economists talk about, that with a guarantee, the financial sector is not worried about losing the money. So those that are constrained, credit constrained or liquidity constrained, or maybe both, would have normally not gotten the credit, but with the guarantee, the financial sector is willing to actually give that loan. Those who are only liquidity constrained will repay back because they are worried about their credit rating getting impacted. It's only those that are credit and liquidity constrained that will default. When they default, what happens? Actually, the guarantee comes in. So it's a quasi transfer, but a quasi cash transfer to those that are genuinely distressed because they are facing credit risk and liquidity risk as well, and the others basically don't get that transfer.
India is one of the few countries where these credit guarantees were
Yes.
larger than the fiscal spending per
Correct.
se.
And in fact, the guarantees were not only to MSMEs, small firms, but also to the urban poor through, by on lending through MFIs. And take a look, the recent, the core sector output actually that has come 18% increase. I think, the fact that we basically got the demand side measures, all spot on by using these leverage, some deep thinking on this, I think is testimony to the fact that India's policy was singularly, positive compared to that of advanced economies. They just printed money like there was no tomorrow, and that's the consequence of that is the runaway inflation that they are suffering. Now, in order to actually fight that inflation, they're actually trying to raise rates, which will create a recession in the economy, advanced economies and in the, emerging economies as well, while India will grow at 7% plus. So which actually tells you, I think, bottom line, therefore, that it was not, worry of credit rating agencies, but a more fundamental identification of the problem, the clarity of thought, number one, to be able to identify a priori, and the courage of conviction to actually be different from the advanced economies as well, because we had thought through and we said, we knew we were actually right, and therefore we went ahead with that courage of conviction.
Yeah, but we are punished not only for our own mistake, but someone else's mistake as well. And I'm just following on this stagflation issue now. So Fed printed money like there's no tomorrow, and it's coming to bite them back.
Yeah.
And there is a high likelihood that we'll probably hit a recession.
Globally speaking. India will not.
Globally speaking. So I want to understand, what are your thoughts? And I know it's a very wide question, but how good are Indian fundamentals to withstand this pretty likely global
Yeah.
crisis.
So I think, see, this is where one needs to understand why we, amidst the COVID pandemic, why did we implement the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy? So after the global financial crisis itself, the heyday of globalization has reversed. Um, Now, while some of the smaller countries, smaller economies don't have the advantage of a very large consumer base, a very large labor supply, India has that advantage. Given the risks, from the reversal of some of the globalization and also, some of the phenomena that we saw during COVID, there are risks. And actually, by utilizing India's strengths of a large consumer base, yeah, I think, India can actually become less immune. I'm not saying that we will ever become, fully immune in a globalized economy, but, the move towards actually utilizing our strengths of a large consumer base was where the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy actually is directed at. Second, if you look at, we why do we care effectively about, about, let's say, it's stagflation or recession in the global economy? Primarily because it affects actually it affects our exports. Now, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, actually, if you look at as a proportion of global exports, our proportion is so less, about 2%, and that's why the double-edged sword. That's the not so good thing. But the good thing then is that, even in a sort of an economy, global economy, where the demand is not growing as much, we can still grow enough, actually, as we economists call at the intrinsic margin, right? Even though the extrinsic margin, which is, the global demand, actually, let's say, does not grow enough, just by growing from 2% to maybe 5% or beyond, actually, we can grow our exports. So by one enabling more, of our output to come from domestic, harnessing our strengths, and the fact that we are at such a low base as a proportion of global exports, that even, when the extrinsic margin is not favorable, we can still grow through the intrinsic margin. I think that's why I don't think India will be impacted as much. And as I said, bottom line, 7% plus growth, India will be the largest, fastest growing economy in the world, not just this year, but I think this decade as well.
But just to set benchmark, like relative to the GFC, which is 2008, we are more integrated in the international economy now than what we were like 12, 13 years ago. So that combined with the current fundamental factors of the economy, you think the shock would be something similar,
No, but
same persistence?
So let me explain, right? What is GDP? GDP is basically consumption plus investment plus, government spending plus net exports, right? Consumption, that's domestic. Okay, yes, maybe a second order effect through sentiment, but the first order effect is basically just the demand, and there is, sort of demand seems to be coming back. So that C is basically, or Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C is not as impacted by global factors. Investment, the focus has been on, encouraging private investment. If you look at the dual balance sheet problem, where actually both our corporates and our banks were excessively leveraged, that is behind us. We've actually, so private investment is waiting to come back, and public investment, which actually we know very well has a crowding in effect, also will enable private investment. So that's not something which will be as impacted. It will be impacted more than consumption, but will not be as impacted by the global factors. Government spending, of course, is endogenous. In other words, that's something the government's choosing, and it's spending on infrastructure. And that's been a big change in the fiscal policy that has happened.
And relatively, we are stronger there.
We are much, much stronger, actually, because our policy, emphasis is different. That leaves only the exports and imports. I think the exports dimension is the one that would get impacted. But as I just said, actually, given that we are at such low levels, we still can grow even in this environment. That is why, based on this careful analysis, I'm saying that the impact of the global factors on the Indian economy, if you think it through in this systematic manner, you will be able to see that I think there's far too much, air being blown on the global economy having too much impact on the Indian economy.
So I'll go a little bit back, and I'm trying to understand the slowdown which India saw in the last few years, even before the COVID. And there you have like a very important paper on bank cleanup, not accompanied at the same time by provisioning for bad loans or capital infusion, if you may say. So why is that a problem? And the asset quality review that RBI initiated in 2015, do you think that was one of the reasons that we saw slight slowdown in the Indian economy?
In fact, not just the paper, but there are, in the economic surveys itself, in the 2019-20 economic survey, the State of the Economy chapter had it was in two sections. One was an assessment of the economy then, but also another section on the slowdown in the economy, where there was rigorous analysis done for what was the reason for the slowdown. Also, in the 2020-21 economic survey, actually wrote a chapter based on this chapter, so based on this paper itself, which was regulatory forbearance. Actually, it's for regulatory forbearance is emergency medicine, not staple diet. So, viewers can refer to both of those as well. So let me focus primarily first on the on the slowdown as the way we explained in the 2020 economic survey. There's a lot of research in financial economics that highlights that when problems start from the financial sector, the overhang of that is much, much larger than when the problems start in the real sector. One can give a lot of examples just for concreteness. If you take the global financial crisis versus the COVID crisis, for instance. During COVID, the year of COVID, the global economy shrunk by about 4.5%. Next year, it was back. Of course, now because of the excessive policies and the bad policies, there is going to be an impact. But it is not because of the shock per se. That if better policies were done by the advanced economies, actually we would have gotten out, and we would not have had to have a global recession. But the example being, when the problem starts in the real sector, overhang is much lower. In contrast, take the global financial crisis. After the Lehman and Bear Stearns failures, then you had actually a full-blown sovereign default crisis as well in the European economies, and that actually is illustrative of the kind of overhang. But these anecdotal examples aside, there's a lot of research. Atif Mia and Amir Sufi, for instance, have a paper. IMF has also written on this, that the overhang from problems that start in the financial sector are far, far longer. And that is why I actually put a lot of blame for the slowdown on the crony lending that happened. Now, how does this overhang manifest? Overhang manifests, which is that banks, when they are seeing bad loans, their first incentive is to actually evergreen them. And of course, it is the job of the regulator to make sure that such evergreening does not happen, and that's part of actually what we show in the chapter that did not happen. The forbearance continued for 7 years.
So this is like after, let's say, 2009 to 2014.
2009 to 2013 is when the excessive lending and crony lending happened. Now, so because loans, especially corporate loans, are about 5 years in maturity, only when the loans are coming back for repayment, that is when you know whether the loan is doing well or not. Ideally you should be monitoring the loan very, very, periodically, but that did not happen. So then banks evergreen. This is something that the regulator should have picked and made sure that the evergreening does not happen, and it did not happen. After evergreening, what banks basically then do is, they end up giving credit to these same, to these zombies, and that is inefficient as well. The regulatory forbearance itself, actually, that was started during the global financial crisis, continued for 7 years. 7 years. We basically not just it was stopped after 7 years, and that is why the title of that chapter, which was saying that regulatory forbearance is emergency medicine. You don't go and eat emergency medicine actually when you're sick. You eat it for 7 years, and of course, if you eat emergency medicine for 7 years, the overhang of that, it's going to be bad health. And what happened was that the dual balance sheet problem, where actually a lot of the corporate, especially the crony promoters who actually got these crony loans, they ended up over leveraging. Banks became significantly over leveraged. When banks became significantly over leveraged, initially they hid, and then the as they say, the shit hit the roof, right? All of this came out. NPAs were recognized, and because there was a lot of crony lending, obviously action had to be taken against those people who actually sort of contributed to this crony lending. That led to then risk aversion among the banks. If you look at the credit itself, during the 2009 to 2014 period, or even 2004 to 2014 period, credit growth was in excess of 20 odd percent. In contrast, after 2014 to 2019 or so, if you take credit growth has been actually about 7-8%, and we know very well that credit growth contributes to to economic growth. So if you're having credit growth of basically 7-8%, obviously it will have an impact on. And how did that impact show up? It showed up in investment. Investment declined significantly, and then also as I've shown in the 2018-19 economic survey, the virtuous cycle. When private investment slows down, there are cascading effects then on growth, thereby on consumption, and all the other effects actually start manifesting. Because when we think about an economy, we have to think about it in a dynamic fashion, not in a static way, but there are several cascading effects. That was what basically led to the slowdown.
If you can say a bit more about the asset quality review,
yes,
that exacerbated the problem.
Exacerbated the problem because the AQR actually was well intended. But when the AQR is done, it has to actually go and identify all the bad assets. It really, because it is a asset quality review. Now, if suppose the asset quality review does not identify all the all the good all the bad assets, then it exacerbates the problem, and that is what. So, in other words, there was nothing wrong with the intent of the AQR itself, but it is in the execution, which is something where actually a broader point. I've always been sort of worried about the quality of banking supervision that we have in this country. Identification of bad assets in time, and making sure that they're provisioned properly. Provisioning was not good either. Actually, for a long while, banks didn't provision, and the regulator didn't push on this aspect as well. So a lot of the blame for for exacerbating what started out as basically crony lending lies at the door of the banking sector regulator itself, and AQR exacerbated.
You mean
that problem.
the RBI?
Of course.
So my last question is about the hitting the $5 trillion mark. When do you think India can hit it?
So firstly, Shekhar, I think it's important to understand the mindset behind setting this goal. As it happens with our own personal goals or corporate goals as well, there's certain focus that comes in. Energy gets directed into into achieving that goal, and that brings a certain clarity of thought and thereby clarity of action as well, which has happened in India's case by setting that target of a $5 trillion economy. If you look at the the policy changes that have happened, in the emphasis on the virtuous cycle, starting from private investment, and there's been an emphasis therefore on private investment. If you see the budget speeches that have made by the finance minister, many times she's mentioned about the virtuous cycle and the importance of private investment. So that's one aspect. Second, the emphasis on infrastructure and public public good creation by the sovereign. We know very well that infrastructure has a force multiplier effect by crowding in private investment. So that's a second key change that has happened. And at the same time, the reforms that have been done, the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy that we talked about, many of the reforms that have been done as part of that to enable the ease of doing business. Because when you look at emerging economies, in contrast to advanced economies, a lot of what holds back the economy is on the supply side. And removing some of the frictions from the supply side is where reforms have to basically focus on. Of course, and I think this is a no-brainer that COVID has impacted goals, the economic goals of every country, including India. It's a once-in-a-century pandemic, which required economic restrictions, and earlier, if you had mentioned about the stringent lockdown that we had, I would just want to mention to the viewers that in that we know that you were talking about the first wave, and we showed in the economic survey very clearly, again using very careful evidence, that it saved a lot of lives, and that has helped us come back, in terms of the economic goals. So I think that going forward, as IMF has already put out its projection, by 2027, I think India should be in a position to actually achieve that target. But I think that if we see some of the uncertainty due to the Ukraine war, and some of the global economic conditions, actually that uncertainty settling down, then I think the growth can actually be faster, and we might be able to achieve the goal earlier as well. I think that then just leaves me to highlight that oftentimes we focus on the impact of averages, the average growth rate, etc. But often, I think the second moment, as we economists call, which is uncertainty, has a much larger impact on consumption and even more on investment. And I therefore I sincerely hope that the uncertainty settles down. And I think here the role of policy cannot be underestimated. I think advanced economies, may want to look at India the way we implemented policy during COVID, by implementing not only demand side but also supply side measures. So just working on demand as it was during COVID without working on supply will mean that the impact on inflation will be there, but there'll be a larger impact on output as well. In contrast, if actually the advanced economies focus on supply side problems as well, I think that then can ensure that the loss in output actually is minimized, is significantly lower compared to just focusing on demand. And I think here, what India did can possibly be a very good case study for advanced economies to learn from.
Thank you, Subbu. It's always a pleasure speaking to you.
My pleasure.